strategic air power to enhance the narrative of air power, a narrative that was fundamentally about decisiveness through destruction. This narrative becomes realized sooner and more fully in the Pacific than it is in Europe. There's a few reasons for that, but one is that Hap Arnold enjoyed more flexibility in the Pacific theater. He even commanded the 20th Air Force, the fleet of B-29 bombers. He commanded them directly himself from D.C. And why? So that Nimitz and MacArthur wouldn't misuse them. Why would they misuse them? Because they don't get it. They lack air-mindedness. They're not operating from the same perspective. They have a different narrative. And Hap's narrative convinces him that this time, air power may have the opportunity to be decisive, to avoid a costly and bloody ground invasion. And these are the men that are going to help him do it. Curtis LeMay, operating initially from China, and Possum Hansel, operating in the Mariana Islands. LeMay was a proven combat leader and innovator from England, operating out of England during the Combined Bomber Offensive. Hansel was a wing commander for the 8th Air Force, both executing high-altitude daylight precision bombing over Europe. Unfortunately, high-altitude daylight precision bombing works even less well in the Pacific than it did in Europe for a number of reasons. The clouds are different, the winds are higher, there's technical difficulties with the B-29s that Hap had rushed into production prior to the testing being complete, but also because Japanese industry is different. It's not the same. There's less opportunity to find that key point. The industries are more spread out throughout the urban fabric. But Possum in particular, he is dedicated to this narrative. He is dedicated to the form of the narrative that seeks decisiveness through destruction if that destruction was precise. And when he's ordered to do imprecise area bombing using incendiary bombs, he balks. He says, I've spent all this time working hard to prove our narrative. And now, to change that, we risk losing all the progress we've made. What Possum doesn't get, what he doesn't understand, is that the narrative is not necessarily about precision. It's more fundamentally about destruction. He doesn't get that, but this man does. When Possum proves incapable of getting results, and worse, incapable of seeing that the narrative is not just constrained, by this point, it's not just constrained to precision bombing, Hap replaces him with someone who Hap said had the right attitude. LeMay is fully committed to strategic bombing, to proving decisiveness through destruction. But he knows that destruction is going to have to take a different form. So 6 weeks into his new command, he takes command in January 1945 of both B-29 organizations, which are now consolidated in the Mariana Islands. 6 weeks later, he decides to exhibit the flexibility that Arnold hired him for. And in the words of his staff, he decides to revolutionize the whole process and go over Japan at low altitude. Why low altitude? You can fly under the clouds. You save fuel. You can carry a larger payload. You save stress on the engines. You actually fly underneath the level that the flak was designed for. And he decides also to go at night because there's less threat from Japanese fighters. So he kicks out the gunners, he kicks out the guns, he saves further weight, he saves further people. But the thing is, you can't do precision bombing at night. That's okay. He's going to make another change as well. He's going to use this new weapon, napalm. When he's planning these attacks on Tokyo, he's not after precision. He's after destruction, and destruction is what he gets. The Tokyo attack was just the first night of 10 days of firebombing. They only stopped to restock napalm and to let people rest. Shine tells us that leaders embed culture in a number of ways. One of them is how they allocate praise, who they hire and who they fire. They hired LeMay, he fired Possum, and in the aftermath of those attacks on Tokyo, there was, quote, a climate of euphoria in Hap's office. He told LeMay that I admire your fine work. It was brilliant. You have proven that we now have the ability to target and destroy whole industrial cities. Not a precise point in a city, the entire city. One report labeled this as probably one of the most important missions ever flown by the Army Air Forces. Hap's staff told LeMay, you are now in a position to prove that air power can do something decisive. And decisiveness is exactly what the narrative promised. Consider the elements of the narrative that are evident in these sentences from a post-war history. Never in the history of war, it is new. Devastation at so slight a cost. It was efficient. An application of American air power. This is an American style of fighting. Surrender without land invasion for the first time. And strategic bombing was victorious, and it was decisive. So why is this a function of a narrative? Why is this not just a story of a subordinate following an order? Because LeMay is never actually given orders to firebomb Tokyo. He doesn't even tell Arnold about all the changes he's making to B-29 tactics. Historian Conrad Crane wrote that Arnold rarely wielded a direct influence on his commanders. In a post-war interview, LeMay said that he had never gotten a direct order from Arnold. Okay, so is this just an example of a creative individual using his superior rationality to solve the problem on his own? I submit to you that's not the case either. Consider this quote from Michael Sherry. While it seemed that LeMay had made an important command decision, what he really had was the illusion of making his own choices, the illusion of autonomy, the illusion of independence. Arnold didn't need to be explicit because that strategy, that narrative of decisiveness through destruction, it was already contained in the culture. It was already the narrative. It's the narrative that guided Hap Arnold. It guided his staff. It guided his commanders, whether they were geographically separated or Arnold was convalescing from multiple heart attacks. Again, that narrative was decisiveness through destruction, and it worked, at least according to them. Remember, culture preserves the solutions that are perceived to be successful, and they certainly perceived the capitulation of the Japanese as proof that strategic bombing could be decisive. Hap said, they surrendered because we destroyed their capability to fight, their will to fight. LeMay said, we had a plan to bomb and burn them until they quit, and it worked. But is this just an example of another cognitive illusion? Confirmation bias? The idea that you see what you want to see, that you take information, you privilege information that already supports the conclusion you've already reached. You undervalue or sometimes outright disregard evidence that contradicts what you've already decided is the right answer. That is something that you will debate in the air power course. Today, the point is that this has leadership implications. There's implications in the fact that narratives abstract from reality and create distortions. That these distortions are often unknown to us. It is hard to know what you don't know. It's hard to stand inside your own narrative, inside your own perspective, your own mindset, and evaluate your own decisions, your own thoughts. It's hard to stand inside your organizational culture and evaluate the solutions promoted by that culture. So yes, while LeMay and Arnold see the defeat of Japan as proof of the effectiveness of strategic bombing, other people see different factors. They point to the island hopping campaign, the one that Sledge participated in, that secured bases, those forward bases for the B-29s, and denied those bases from the Japanese. Others point to the mining and blockade operations conducted largely by the Navy. Others point to the Soviet entry into the Japanese war. But probably the biggest assumption that they made was that destruction equals decisiveness. But physical effects do not necessarily correlate to psychological effects. Destruction does not necessarily equal surrender. It doesn't necessarily mean that you destroy their will to fight. Because of these vulnerabilities, it is critical to find and nurture what we call the outside view. Look for others that are outside of your perspective. This is very unnatural. It's unnatural because they don't get it. They don't see the world like we see it. They have a different narrative. Why would we trust someone else's opinion if they don't have it right? That's precisely what makes them useful as devil advocates. It's not necessarily that their mental map is better. It might be. but it might have different details than yours does. It might have a distortion in a different way. That's the value of bringing a diverse group of people together. That's why we bring people from different AFSCs, different militaries, different countries, different intergovernmental agencies. We bring them here together. So if narratives are instinctual, if they're going to happen anyway, and they're influential, and if senior leaders have a responsibility to tell the institution's story, then they must craft a story that mitigates against those vulnerabilities. They need to craft a story that takes those vulnerabilities and turns them into strengths. So if cultures favor continuity, craft a narrative of continuously learning. If cultures preserve habits, create a narrative of habitually questioning the culture. If cultures focus on consistency, on solving things in the same way, make it a narrative of always looking for a new, better solution. A narrative of consistent adaptation, of constant evolution. A narrative that worships at the altar of what is new. New ideas, new perspectives, new strategies, and yes, even new technologies. And focuses on how these new ideas, these new strategies, these new technologies can change the way war is fought. So here's my pitch for a new Air Force narrative. And it's not really new at all. It's implicit in this entire story. Just as high-altitude daylight precision bombing gave way to a more fundamental narrative about decisiveness through destruction, that must give way to a narrative that focuses on change, innovation, and creativity. Those ideas have underwritten this entire story. We need to focus on a domain beyond the effects of airspace and cyberspace. We need to focus on the cognitive domain, a domain of ideas. Ideas that give rise to technology. Technologies that allowed us to access air and space in the first place, and technologies that created cyberspace. We need a domain of ideas crafted into a persuasive story to communicate clearly, concisely, and convincingly. We need a narrative that shapes the organization internally and externally, whether it's influencing our joint partners, our intergovernmental partners, our allies, or our enemies. This idea of change and innovation and creativity, it's been part of the Air Force story from the beginning. And that's why the Air Force should be the organization that is best capable of doing creative thought at a strategic level. Aviation was born out of minds looking to do the impossible. And once they succeeded, air power was then promoted by minds trying to change the way wars were fought, something that people still today say is impossible. These new ideas required new weapons, new organizations, new strategies, and new perspectives. Above all, it required new leaders to craft and employ new narratives. Leaders like Hap Arnold. Commanders who expect to lead well in joint warfare need to master both the science of leadership and the art of leadership. One of those artistic skills must be strategic communication, the ability to craft a compelling and empowering narrative, a narrative that prioritizes superiority in the cognitive domain above all else. And maybe one day, in the right context, the power of an idea, skillfully communicated, will be the decisive effect necessary to finally win quickly, cheaply, and completely. How fitting for those ideas to come from the service that itself was born as the embodiment of an idea. Thank you.